So it's really lovely to be here. Thank you very much, Saravantu, for inviting me to this evening. Um, I've not been to. Do we say Shrewsbury and not Shrewsbury? I've never been to Shrewsbury or Shrewsbury before. Although one of my very good friends was born here, I believe. So I think Padma Singh was born in your very town. And I also know, including the three order members that are here, that you've got a great bunch of order members in your town, many of whom I've bumped into in one way or another over the years. So I think that Shrewsbury must have very good karma to deserve such a fine bunch of order members. So I'm going to go into my talk. I'm going to begin now, and what I'll do is I'll talk for, I don't know, maybe half an hour or so. Then, depending on the time, there might be time for questions and answers. But if either way, we'll then break out into groups, and I'll pose a few questions to give you a chance to sort of reflect on some of the material before, we finish off with a meditation. So, as many of you will know, it was Buddha Day recently. It was Wesak recently. So, the May full moon is when Buddhists across the world celebrate the enlightenment of the Buddha. And also, conveniently, some of them, I think, celebrate his birthday and death as well. So, you get three for the price of one if you're for some flavours of Buddhists. But certainly, all Buddhists celebrate his enlightenment in the full moon in May. And I've been thinking about the Buddha as a consequence of that. I gave a talk for the Worthing Sangha. Worthing is in West Sussex, quite near me. And I gave a talk to celebrate Wesak. And not surprisingly, in that talk, I spoke about the Buddha's awakening. But I also spoke about the first people that he met. And there's something for me about, how I'm sure you have this experience. I certainly have it of, perhaps you don't know what sort of state of mind you're in as you bumble through your day, but other people's responses to you kind of mirror you back. And I think for that reason, I'm really interested in accounts of people that the Buddha met after he was enlightened, perhaps as a way to understand what that might be, the experience of awakening, the experience of enlightenment. And there are a couple of encounters that I spoke about in that talk. There was the man who Ashvaghosha speaks about in the Buddha Charita. And he speaks about this man who apparently is the first person that the Buddha met after he'd woken up. They're walking, the Buddha is walking to find the five ascetics to speak to them. Because he sort of thinks they might understand what went on with him. And he's walking through the dusty paths of northern India between the villages, the mud hut villages. And this man's walking towards him on the path. And this man's very struck by this being that he sees coming towards him, who is the Buddha. And I'm going to make a short version of this story. But he stops the Buddha. He has to stop the Buddha, and he says to the Buddha that he's like the full moon. That's the first image he gives. And then he says that the Buddha it's like he's got the gaze of a bull. And then he goes on to say, I didn't realize this, but every other person I've met, it's like they were surrounded by wild horses. But it's like you are surrounded by tame horses. So we could spend the rest of the talk going into that, but we're not. That's just an aside. That's just a taster. But there's something for me about those images of the full moon, of the gaze of the bull, and of the tame horses. The Buddha being surrounded by tame horses. But what's most interesting is then the man legs it. So he doesn't say, I'd like to be, follow you forever. He actually slightly freaks out and goes off. And the Buddha kind of waits around. This man, apparently, he walks away, he turns around and looks at the Buddha once. He carries on walking, turns around and looks at the Buddha again, filled with longing. And then the third time he turns around and looks at the Buddha's gone over a hill. And that's the last we hear of him. So that's the first person. And then there's the Buddha meeting the ascetics. So these people that he's been doing these extreme practices with of self-mortification, starvation, and then the Buddha realizes that that's not getting him anywhere. He goes off on his own. But after he gains enlightenment, he kind of wonders if these five men will actually be able to understand what's happened to him, to be able to understand what he's realized. So he heads off. After he's seen the man I was just telling you about, he heads off to Isipatana, near Sarnath, and he goes to talk to them. Now they see him from a distance away, and unlike the man who was really impressed by him, they sort of say, just ignore him. Just ignore the loser. I mean, that's not a direct translation from the Pali, but you can imagine that he was the best ascetic there was, the Buddha, and then he turned away from it. So they're quite annoyed with the Buddha. They're not impressed at all. So they try not to be impressed by him. But actually, despite their best intentions, they find themselves making a seat for him and welcoming him into their circle, because there's something about his presence, something about the nobility and beauty of his presence, which despite themselves, they have to respond to. And then they talk through the night. Kandanya, one of those five men, also awakens. He sees as the Buddha has seen. He penetrates reality. And the wheel of the Dharma is turned for the first time. And the Sangha grows. So those five ascetics become the first members of the Buddhist Sangha. Anyway, that was my talk on Buddha Day. And there's another episode that I'm really struck by from the life of the Buddha. It's always struck me. I do think there's so much in the story, the myth of the life of the Buddha. But it's that point in his life when he saw he'd reached a dead end in terms of his ascetic practices. He'd done extreme yoga, he'd done extreme starvation, he'd done all these things. And actually, he'd not got to where he hoped. He wasn't free, he wasn't liberated, he hadn't woken up. And we're told that he just quite naturally recollected a time in his early life when he was sitting under a tree. The rose apple tree. He was in nature. It was this beautiful landscape that he was in. He was under the shade of a tree, and he was watching his dad, who was ritually beginning the ploughing season by ploughing a bit of land, because his dad was a leader in his local clan, his local area. And the Buddha had an intuition that the state of mind that he'd achieved quite naturally when he was under that tree, when he was a boy, could lead him somewhere, could take him somewhere. You could say that what the Buddha did by having that intuition about his memory was that he came back to himself. These ascetic practices, he'd been doing these things that other people had said would work for him, but he recognized he'd not got where he wanted, and he kind of came back to himself. And when he'd come back to himself and in a way found something in his experience from when he was a child that he could work with, he was able to continue to work with that and to practice, and ultimately to wake up, to gain enlightenment. And there's lots of things that image of the Buddha as a boy under this tree, which led to him as a man sitting under the Bodhi tree and awakening. There's so much that it speaks of him being under that tree as a boy. There's something about it being quite a beautiful place he was in. There's a sense of him being collected and relaxed. There's a sense of him being joined up. He's in his life in a way. In contrast to the extremities of asceticism, and in that calm, in that beauty, he's able to see things as they are, you could say, or that gives him a road that he can go along to see things as they are. So there's something for me about self-understanding in that process that the Buddha went through. there's something about him recognizing the limitations of the extreme behaviors he'd engaged in. You could even call it a kind of an extreme willfulness, perhaps. That somehow he would force himself to experience reality, even a drivenness, perhaps. And he came back to something that was much more centered in a way. And I think that one of the things it says to me is that for spiritual growth to happen, we need to have a deeper awareness of our own nature. And you could say, to extend that metaphor, we need to have an understanding of the garden of the self, an understanding of the wildness of the garden of the self, an understanding of what grows there, and how to grow what we need to grow for the full flowering of awakening to happen. And in a way, to grow spiritually, one of the things that we need to have is an understanding that we can grow. And in a way, understanding that our nature as human beings is more of the nature of a garden than a fixed thing, than something that's made of concrete or brick or is dead. In a way, we need to understand that our nature as human beings is more like there is the garden of the self, or even the garden of the mind, teeming with life and also teeming with potential. So it does seem very appropriate that we have some people who are outside as I speak about this, perhaps in their own gardens. This is a time of year for us to be able to easily connect with nature. I've wild camped every week since November, and let me tell you, it's much easier to connect with nature this month than it was in January. So maybe it's easier for us at this time of year to connect with the richness and beauty of nature, and perhaps for that to give echoes to our own nature. Yes, so one of the Buddha's main insights was that we don't have a fixed self. We don't have a fixed core, though we can habitually behave as if we do. And if we do habitually behave as if we're fixed in some sort of essential way, that maybe we can tweak around the edges, but we're sort of fixed in an essential way, then that's problematic, really, because we're living in a way that's fighting with how things are. And Buddhism says that if we do change the things that we do in our days, if we plant seeds and consciously grow things in the garden, instead of staying stuck, instead of things staying as they are largely, we'll grow, we'll develop, we'll change. And in terms of the garden of the self, Buddhism would say it's not just about rearranging the garden furniture. It's not just about putting the table over there and moving the parasol over there. It's a much more radical growth and a much more radical transformation that Buddhist practice is about. And the Buddha himself underwent this radical transformation, you could say, setting up the conditions for awakening. He recognized his own potency, his own agency. He was able to take responsibility for himself. He was able to come to understand what he needed to do to grow, to continue to use that metaphor. And he flowered, and you could say that enlightenment is a full flowering, to go with that metaphor. So those of you who know me half well will not be surprised that I want to read a poem to you. So if you're allergic to poetry, I invite you to indulge me. And also just to say to you, don't feel like you need to kind of get all the poem, that you're not going to be tested on it. So just let the poem sort of sink into your ears and sink into your heart. And it's a poem, perhaps not surprisingly, called The Garden, written by a Yorkshireman who isn't me, Andrew Marvell, who was around in the 17th century. And you could say it's a rejoicing in nature, of the bounty of nature, and also a recognition of the transformation that happens when we engage with nature, when we really meet nature. And that could be our own nature as well as nature outside of ourselves. It's about a bountiful heart and a bountiful mind. So I'm just going to read a paragraph and then read another paragraph. How wondrous is this life I lead! Ripe apples drop about my head. The luscious clusters of the vine upon my mouth do crush their wine. The nectarine and curious peach into my hands themselves do reach. Stumbling on melons as I pass, ensnared with flowers, I fall on grass. So there's a real sense of him being held by the bounty of nature. The bounty of his own fruitful mind, I think of it, and all of these fruits presenting themselves to him. And then as we go further on in the poem, there's a change, and in a way we move into the garden of the mind more fully. So this is how it ends. Meanwhile, the mind, from pleasure less, withdraws into its happiness. The mind, that ocean where each kind does straight its own resemblance find. Yet it creates, transcending these, far other worlds and other seas, annihilating all that's made to a green thought in a green shade. And I think when he uses the word annihilate, we think of that as very negative. It usually has negative connotations, but there's a real sense for me of refinement and transcendence there. It's almost as if he's enjoyed the bounty and bliss of the mind, and then there's a refinement and a seeing into things more deeply, a mystical joy, you could say. To see something more real and more true. And it also connects with some lines of Wordsworth's. There are only 3 of those for you, those of you who are having poetry panics, but just 3 more lines. Where Wordsworth says, in lines written above Tintern Abbey, he says, "With an eye made quiet by the power of harmony and the deep power of joy, we see into the life of things." So there's something for me about, Wordsworth, who wasn't even a Mitra, tree rattler joke, was deeply engaged in meditation, you could say, and having that sense of the joy of engaging with nature and of a sense of harmony, he sees into the life of things. So I think Marvell and also Wordsworth are kind of exploring nature and our own nature through the garden. So yes, this is a seeing into the life of things at its richest and deepest, when we engage with nature, when we engage with our own nature, and we're transformed through this. The flowering which would be the awakening of enlightenment. So this way of talking about nature, the vegetable world, there's so much variety and richness, isn't there? There's so much that can grow, there's so much that can be sown, and of course there are weeds. And this speaks to me of the spiritual life. Now, before you can grow anything, you need to know quite a lot of stuff. Saravantu was saying that she was in her allotment at 7:30 this morning, so she perhaps knows something about needing to go early to the allotment. But in a way, in order to grow things in our garden, and I'm speaking literally and also metaphorically here, we need to understand the soil. We need to understand how the light moves. We need to understand the shade. And you need to work with things that you find in the garden. In my garden, which is just there, I've got some whopping ash trees that I need to just work with those. I'm not going to chop them down. They're majestic and beautiful, but they also impact on what else I can grow. There's stuff already in our garden, and particularly when we are cultivating the garden of the self, of the spiritual life, It's we don't just weed killer everything. You know, it's not about Monsantoing the whole patch and starting from a raised ground. That just wouldn't work at all. We might need to do some weeding. We might need to get a spade under one of those clumps that really needs levering out into that pervasive weed. And also we just need to understand that we may plant some things that don't grow. Or we may plant some things that we don't think have grown. I have honeysuckle just over there, which I planted 5 years ago, and only this year has it flowered. So the gardener needs quite a lot of patience, really. You can't rush things. You can't bend things to your will. And I think this is also true of the spiritual life. Yeah, so there's something about getting a sense of the lay of the land, trying out stuff and seeing if it will grow. And some of it won't work, you know, and we put that down to experience. But some of it will. And in a way, we cultivate what's there. You know, in my case, quite literally, there was a real aubergine disaster. And I'm not even going to mention Gooseberry Gate to you. I'm just not going to mention it. But, oh, the tomatoes, the rhubarb, the foxgloves, the quince tree, you know, there have been successes as well. And there's something about we keep going with patience and with an understanding of the land and the landscape, the place that we're in, where we are doing our work. And then, of course, things come that we don't plant. You know, in my case, the bluebells and the wild garlic came. What a complete surprise. And we witnessed the flowering and we witnessed the dying in the same year. And then the birds come and the weeds come. And some of the weeds we learn to love, and some of the weeds we decide they need to go. So as you can imagine, I could carry on for some time in this vein, but I'm going to stop. But I think it's just in a way important for us to recognise there's always the possibility for growth. And there's always the possibility that we can spend a moment appreciating what we have grown already, whether that's in the garden of the spiritual life or whether that's in the garden. And I'm now going to share with you a mystical comment that I came across on Gardener's Question Time. That core place for Dharma learning. So the mystical comment is this: the best manure is the shadow of the gardener. I got Akasha Raja's eyebrows there. I got a double eyebrow raise. The best manure is the shadow of the gardener. So I think what that means is, for us, that it's about turning up. It's about being there in the garden and doing the cultivation. Because the spiritual garden, just as the actual garden, requires effort, it requires awareness, it requires vigilance, it requires turning up. You know, if we leave the garden of the mind, the garden of the self, if we leave it to go wild, the brambles will come back. So, you might be relieved to discover that vegetable and plant metaphors are very strong in traditional Buddhism. It's not just me going on about my garden. So after the Buddha's awakening, perhaps we know of the story that's told that the Buddha looked out upon the whole world, you know, with all of its continents and all of its beings in it. And he saw humanity, the whole of humanity across the world. And he saw humanity as lotuses. So as lotuses growing in a pond. Some of the lotuses were right at the bottom of the pond in the mud. Some were half emerging from the mud, reaching towards the light. Some of them were on the surface of the water with their lustrous leaves and petals fully opened, drinking in the sun. So that was the image that the Buddha had of humanity. And I think that for me, it's not so much that perhaps there is something in there in recognizing that people are at different stages of spiritual development, but perhaps more importantly is recognizing that there is always a possibility of growth. There is always a possibility of unfoldment. And there's also the parable of the rain cloud. So extending the vision of the lotuses, the notion that beings are like plants or flowers or trees, and then nourished by the plentiful rain of the Dharma. So the rain, just like the rain falls equally, on the village, let's say, the rain of the Dharma falls equally on all of the beings, and they're equally soused by the rain of the Dharma, but each grows according to their own natures. So, the Dharma, the rain of the Dharma, in a way doesn't control whether if we have a tree, it will grow into a tree. If we have a bush, it will grow into a bush. If we have a flower, it will grow into a flower. But what the Dharma does do, it encourages that growth to fullness according to their own natures. And there's something there, I think, for us to have a sense of. That awakening, in a way, will look different for each of us. Spiritual growth and development will look different for each of us. There will be some absolute core similarities between each awakening. The experience in its essence will be the same, but how it will look will be quite different. So I hope that you feel sufficiently immersed in the world of growth and development and plants. In a way, this is not a linear talk. I've hovered over an area as a way of kind of marinating you, perhaps, in that metaphor. And in a way, I suppose, I hope that it's an invitation for you to see your own spiritual life as one of growth and cultivation. I think that, we talk about the spiritual path. That's another metaphor that's used, isn't it, in terms of spiritual development. And it can be useful to talk about the path. I like paths myself, but perhaps it can appear like, you're going in a straight line. Or you're moving in a certain direction, and that can be useful too. That can be useful, but I think it can be really helpful to have the counterpoint of the image of that sense of growth and unfoldment. I think to hold both of them can be really helpful for us to understand what it is to develop spiritually. And I hope this presentation also helps you to be able to see each other's gardens, to see each other's spiritual growth and development, to see the efforts of the gardeners that we all are, and to see the fruits of our gardening. So there's something about, can we witness our own growth? Can we witness each other's growth? And to kind of see in the being witnessed and in the witnessing, perhaps we can see the beauty in that. The beauty of our efforts and the beauty of the flowers and fruits that appear from that work. And you could say that's what spiritual friendship is. Spiritual friendship really is about witnessing others' growth and development and seeing the beauty in that. So that's really my presentation, is just entering into the world of a green thought in a green shade, of growth and development. And may each of our gardens grow ever more beautiful. And at the same time, may we come to recognize there is only one garden.